Sir, thank you for taking your time to come and give us an interview. Could you please present yourself?
My name's Phil Clark, and I'm a lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London, and I also convene a network at the University of Oxford called Oxford Transitional Justice Research.
Thank you. I understand today's conference was about democratic changes in Central Africa. Could you please maybe tell our viewers what the conference was about?
I think the purpose of tonight's conference was really to look at how important elections are or maybe aren't in terms of democracy in Africa. It's a question of, are elections just a ritual that people go through, or do they actually mean something much more than that? So we looked at the examples of Rwanda, Uganda, and also Southern Sudan, and the recent elections in those three countries.
Why specifically those three countries?
I think those three countries were chosen because, firstly, they've had recent elections, and also the elections have been quite heavily contested and I guess quite controversial in those three places. And also, I guess, they're elections that happen in the same space as a violent conflict. So we looked a great deal at this relationship between democratic processes and violence, and what kind of situations can come out of those two dynamics.
Thank you. That part of Africa is experiencing some difficult democratic changes there. People seem to think that although they are going through elections, actually there is no democracy in that part of Africa. What do you think is the cause?
I'm not so sure that we can say that there's no democracy in these parts of Africa. I think what we're seeing is populations that are really wrestling with what democracy means and how exactly to go about it. And I think one of the real impediments to democracy, and we talked about this a great deal this evening, was what happens when you have weak institutions, weak political institutions. And also what happens when countries are experiencing violent conflict. Is that the right time for elections? I think many policymakers and many commentators believe that elections are somehow a cure-all, that if we have elections, it'll deal with all of these problems of political divisions, violent conflict, reconciliation, and all the rest of it. But I think what we very much talked about tonight was the fact that, if anything, elections tend to destabilise situations. They tend to bring tensions to the fore. Or, according to one of the speakers tonight, elections maybe don't even touch political issues at all. They become a kind of charade that people go through, and they use it in order to avoid very important political issues. So I think the consensus this evening was that actually elections, if anything, play a very peripheral role in terms of democracy in the long term. And so maybe we should be a bit sceptical about how important the actual process of elections really is.
Okay, the West seems to be supporting government in those countries, well, with the exception of Sudan maybe. Why do you think that the West is still acting selectively in terms of supporting democracy in that part of the world?
I think by this stage, Western donors have become so heavily involved in so many parts of Africa that they feel a need to maintain their influence and continue to try to shape events on the ground. It's almost as though Western donors have spent too long on the continent and so really can't extricate themselves in any shape or form. But also, Africa increasingly is of great value, particularly to the West. It's of great economic value. We're seeing Africa go through an economic boom at the moment that I think very few people could have predicted. And also, Africa increasingly is important in terms of geopolitics and security questions. The Horn of Africa, I guess, issues of piracy and warlordism and the rest of it are of grave concern to many Western donors. And so there's a desire by outsiders to remain involved in Africa, on the one hand for economic gain, but on the other hand because of these worries about security.
Thank you. I don't know if you can say something about what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They seem to have some support coming from China, and the West is still very unclear about what to do with China in Central Africa. Why do you think the West is fearful of the support China is providing, particularly to the Democratic Republic of Congo?
African governments are becoming increasingly intelligent about how to deal with outside actors. And I think one of the ways in which this is manifesting is that governments are realizing that you have to generate alliances with a wide range of international actors. It's not just good enough to pick one or two. And at the moment, I think there's a huge realization by many African governments that China is the emerging power globally. That it's time to really come on board with China and benefit from Chinese investment. And of course, China has been very smart about this. It realizes that it's competing with the US, the EU, the UK, and other actors for economic gain and influence in Africa. And China's comparative benefit to African states is that it's much less concerned about human rights records than the US or other actors might be. It's playing, I think, a very, very smart game on the ground. And so a country like the DRC is a very good example of playing the superpowers off against each other, recognizing that the best deal might come about because you've actually put US interests up against Chinese interests and seen which one actually benefits you the most. I think in the case of Kabila and Congo, that's been a really important part of the mining industry and other economic concerns recently. So with China's emergence in Africa, all manner of economic and political issues are changing irrevocably, I would say.
Thank you. What I think China is trying to do when I went to Africa, to the DRC, is that they are investing in things which are really benefiting the population straight away. And in return, they want more or less to take some resources back to China. What is wrong in doing that?
Arguably, very little is wrong with doing that. I think many Central African governments would say that they've benefited enormously from Chinese investment. That you're exactly right, that not only have Chinese businesses entered Africa and extracted resources, but they've left a great deal. They've built roads, they've built hospitals, they've left tangible infrastructure, which then benefits the local population. I guess the concern for the US and the UK is that they are losing ground to Chinese influence.
So it's about competition?
I think this is undoubtedly about competition. And to my mind, it's the right of African governments to work out how they can get the best deal. And if that means playing Chinese interest off against others, then more power to them.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, sir.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.